Theda stepped down from the stagecoach, and the dust of redemption, Wyoming, settled on her like a shroud. It coated the hem of her best gray dress, the one she had saved for this day, turning it the color of mouse fur. It filled her nose with the scent of dry earth and horse, and something else. Something like disappointment. The town was little more than a single dusty street flanked by tired-looking clapboard buildings, all of it shrinking under a sky too vast and empty to comprehend. This was her new home. This was the place her life began again. A man with a drooping mustache and a sweat-stained hat spat a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. "You the mail order?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the flat curiosity of a man inspecting livestock. Theda clutched the handle of her single carpet bag, the worn fabric the only familiar thing in this entire alien landscape. "I am Theda. I am here to be wed to Mr. Nate Callaway." The words sounded strange and formal, like a speech learned by rote. She had practiced them for 1,000 miles, across swaying train cars and rattling coach seats, and they still felt like a lie. A bride. She was a bride with no family to see her off, no dowry but the fare that had brought her here, and a heart so heavily patched with grief and hope it was a wonder it still beat at all. The man grunted and gestured with his thumb toward the far end of the street, where the town gave way to endless, rolling prairie. "Callaway's Foreman's over there, fellow with the black hat. Callaway's place is a half-day's ride out, biggest spread in the territory." He squinted at her. "You got grit, miss? You'll need it for that one." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and ambled into the saloon, the doors swinging shut behind him. Theda was left alone again, an island in the river of dust. She saw the man in the black hat, leaning against a wagon loaded with supplies. He was watching her, his face unreadable from this distance. Taking a breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, she started walking toward him, each step an act of will. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and weathered by the sun. His eyes, when she got close enough to see them, were a pale, cold blue. He didn't move as she approached, just watched her with an air of weary impatience. This must be the foreman. "I am Theda," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "Mr. Callaway is expecting me." The foreman, whose name she would learn was Jed, pushed himself off the wagon. "He's expectin' you, is he?" His tone was laced with something sharp and unpleasant. "Funny. He ain't mentioned it. Get in the wagon. I ain't got all day." He didn't offer to take her bag. He just climbed onto the driver's seat and picked up the reins, leaving her to heave her belongings over the side and scramble up after them. The ride was silent and brutal. The wagon jolted over ruts in the trail, and the sun beat down without mercy. Theda said nothing, just held onto the side of the wagon bed, her knuckles white. The foreman, Jed, said nothing either. The silence was a thing of its own, heavy and hostile. It confirmed the stagecoach driver's warning. "You'll need it for that one." He hadn't meant the land, he had meant the man. Nate Callaway. Her husband. They passed through a huge carved wooden gate that read, "Callaway Ranch." The scale of it was staggering. The trail wound through miles of pasture where hundreds, perhaps thousands of cattle grazed. Men on horseback moved in the distance, small figures in a vast painted landscape. This was a kingdom, and the man she had come to marry was its king. The main house was a 2-story structure of dark timber and stone, imposing and solid, with a wide porch that looked out over the entire valley. But Jed didn't stop there. He guided the wagon past the grand house, past the cookhouse and the bunkhouse where men stopped their work to stare at her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He finally pulled the horses to a halt in front of a small, isolated cabin set well away from the main cluster of buildings, near a grove of cottonwoods. "This is you," he said, jerking his head toward the cabin. It was small, little more than a shack, with a stone chimney and a single window that stared out like a vacant eye. Boss'll be along? He didn't wait for a reply. He clicked the reins and the wagon rumbled away, leaving her standing in front of the little house with her bag in her hand and a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Theda pushed open the door. The cabin was clean but stark. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small table with one chair, a cold fireplace, and a shelf with a basin and a pitcher. It was a room for a servant, not a wife. She walked to the window and looked back toward the main house. It stood on its low hill like a fortress, powerful and unapproachable. She had traveled 1,000 miles to be a bride, only to be exiled to the farthest edge of her husband's kingdom on the very day she arrived. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the dust of the road still on her dress, and for the first time since her father's funeral, she felt the burn of tears behind her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Crying was a luxury she had never been able to afford. An hour passed, maybe more. The sun began to dip toward the jagged line of the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Theda had washed her face in the cool water from the pitcher and was attempting to smooth the wrinkles from her dress when the sound of boots on the gravel outside made her freeze. The door opened without a knock. He was taller than she'd imagined. His shoulders filled the doorway, blocking the last of the evening light. He wore no hat, and his hair was a dark brown, streaked with gray at the temples. His face was all harsh lines and angles, a face carved from granite and grief. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, startling blue, but they were shuttered, closed off. He looked at her, not as a man looks at his bride, but as he might look at a fence post that needed mending. A problem to be dealt with. This was Nate Callaway, her husband. "Mrs. Callaway," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of a legal fact he seemed to already regret. "The arrangement stands. This cabin is yours. You'll take your meals in the cookhouse with the men. I expect you to be discreet." Theda stood, her hands clasped in front of her. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways. A shy smile, a clumsy handshake. Perhaps, if she were lucky, a word of welcome. She had not imagined this chilling transaction. "Mr. Callaway," she said, her voice steady despite the sinking in her chest. "I understand." He seemed taken aback by her lack of protest. He had clearly expected tears or demands. Her quiet acceptance unsettled him. He looked around the spare cabin, his gaze lingering for a moment on her single bag. "There's a ledger in the main house. Any supplies you require, you write them down. The cook will see to it." "Thank you," she said. An awkward silence stretched between them. He seemed to be searching for something more to say, some protocol for this impossible situation. He had purchased a wife like he might purchase a new bull, and now the creature was here, standing in his yard, and he didn't know what to do with it. He was the most powerful man for 100 miles, and this small woman with quiet eyes and folded hands had somehow robbed him of all his authority. "My first wife," he began, then stopped. The name died on his lips. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken sorrow. "She passed, in childbirth." The words were clipped, brutal. He was not sharing a confidence. He was posting a warning. "This is a place of loss. Do not bring your hope here." The child, too. Theda's own losses were too fresh, too raw. She recognized the shape of his pain. It was the same hollowed-out emptiness she carried inside herself. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Callaway," she said, and the words were not a platitude. They were a simple, aching truth. He flinched, as if her sympathy were a physical blow. He had walled himself in with guilt and power, and her simple decency had found a crack in the stone. He looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time, and for a fleeting second, The shutters on his eyes lifted. He saw not just the mail-order bride, but a woman whose stillness seemed to hold a world of its own. Then the shutters fell again. "Right," he said, turning abruptly. "Jed, the foreman, will show you the cookhouse in the morning." He walked out, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the gathering dark. Theda stood motionless for a long time, listening to the sound of his boots fading away. She had not been welcomed. She had been installed. Like a piece of furniture he was obliged to keep, but preferred to store in the attic. She walked to the window and looked out at the vast, indifferent land. She was married, but she had never been more alone. The days that followed settled into a routine of quiet endurance. Theda rose before the sun, took her meals at the far end of a long table in the cookhouse, and tried to make herself invisible. The ranch hands watched her, some with pity, some with a crude curiosity. Jed, the foreman, watched her with open contempt. He seemed to feel her presence as a personal affront, a disruption to the hard, masculine world he inhabited. Nate Callaway she saw only at a distance, a powerful figure on horseback, directing his men, his face always turned away. He never spoke to her. He never looked toward her cabin. It was as if their one stark conversation had never happened. She had nothing to do. Her hands, so used to the endless work of nursing her ailing father, the mixing of poultices, the changing of linens, the quiet stitching of wounds, were now idle. She swept the cabin, mended the small tears in her two dresses, and walked the perimeter of the cottonwood grove. But the hours stretched into an eternity of uselessness. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was not her own. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, a commotion from the direction of the main corral shattered the oppressive quiet. Shouts, the terrified scream of a horse, the sharp crack of splintering wood. Theda stepped out of her cabin, her heart quickening. Men were running toward the corral, their faces tight with alarm. Drawn by an instinct she couldn't name, she followed. When she reached the fence, she saw the source of the chaos. It was a stallion. A magnificent creature of pure black, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian even now as it was slicked with sweat and blood. His eyes were wide with terror and pain, and a deep, horrific gash ran the length of his left foreleg, torn open on a broken fence rail. Blood pulsed from the wound, staining the dust a dark, ugly red. Jed and two other hands were trying to get a rope around the stallion's neck. The horse, maddened by pain, reared and struck, his hooves flashing like weapons. He was a force of nature, untamable. "Hold him!" a voice roared, and Theda saw Nate Callaway vault over the fence into the corral. He moved with a desperate, focused grace, trying to get to the stallion's head to calm him. "Can't get near him, boss," Jed yelled, dodging a kick that would have shattered his skull. "He's gonna bleed out or kill one of us. We gotta put him down." "No." Nate's voice was raw. He loved this horse. Theda could see it in the taut line of his jaw, in the desperate way he moved. This was not just livestock. This was something more. "Get more ropes." But Theda knew ropes wouldn't be enough. The horse was too far gone in his panic. They would never hold him still enough to treat a wound that severe. Putting him down was the only sensible option. But as she looked at the beautiful, terrified animal, another instinct took over, the healer's instinct her father had drilled into her. Never give up on a life, not while it still fights. Without thinking, without asking permission, she slipped between the rails and into the corral. "Get out of here, woman!" Jed bellowed, his face red with exertion and fury. "You want to get killed." Nate turned, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "Theda, get back!" She ignored them both. Her world had shrunk to the space between her and the wounded stallion. She kept her movements slow, her body relaxed. She didn't look the horse in the eye, which he would see as a challenge. Instead, she watched his ears, his flaring nostrils, the trembling of his hide. She began to speak, her voice low and soft, a meaningless, rhythmic murmur, the same sound she had used to soothe her father during his night terrors. "Easy now," she crooned, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Easy, beautiful boy. I see you. I see you're hurt. Let the fear go. Just for a moment. Let it go." The stallion stopped rearing. He stood trembling, his head high, his ears swiveling toward the sound of her voice. The men fell silent, stunned. Theta continued her soft monologue, a river of sound in the tense silence. She took another step, and then another. She was close now, close enough to smell the blood and the sweat and the fear. She raised a hand, slowly, palm open, and held it out. The horse blew a great shuddering breath through his nose, his hot breath misting on her skin. He watched her hand, his wild eyes losing some of their frantic edge. He didn't move. He just stood, quivering, as if held in place by the fragile thread of her voice. "That's it," she whispered. "That's a good boy." She was beside him now. She reached out and laid her hand gently on his powerful, sweat-drenched neck. He flinched but did not pull away. Her touch was as light as a moth's wing. She stroked him, her fingers finding the tense, knotted muscles and working them with a gentle pressure. "No one will hurt you now." Nate and his men watched, frozen in astonishment. His foreman couldn't hold the horse still, but this slip of a woman had tamed him with a touch and a whisper. Theta moved her hand down his shoulder, never breaking contact, her voice a constant, soothing hum. She knelt in the bloody dust, her dress forgotten, and examined the wound. It was deep, down to the bone in one place, but the arteries seemed to be intact. It was cleanable. It was stitchable. "I can fix this," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the stunned silence. She looked up at Nate. "But I need things. Hot water, clean cloths, a needle and strong thread. Whiskey." Nate stared at her hand resting calmly on the neck of an animal that had been a maelstrom of violent panic moments before. He saw the confidence in her eyes, the steady competence in her posture. This was not the timid woman from the cabin. This was someone else entirely. He broke from his stupor. "You heard her!" He barked at his men, who jumped as if startled from a dream. "Move!" They scrambled to obey. In minutes, they returned with what she'd asked for. Theta took the bottle of whiskey and poured a generous amount onto a clean rag, then began to clean the wound. The stallion shuddered, a deep groan rumbling in his chest, but he did not move. He stood as if rooted to the spot, his head lowered slightly, his trust placed entirely in the small woman at his feet. Theta threaded the needle. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. She had stitched her father's skin more times than she could count, stitched torn canvas on the trail, stitched everything that could be mended. The flesh of a horse was not so different. She took the first stitch, pulling the ragged edges of the skin together. A bride stitched his wounded stallion standing up. The thought was absurd, a line from a mad story. But it was happening. Nate watched, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He watched her sure, swift hands. He watched the way the magnificent, powerful horse leaned into her touch, accepting the pain of the needle because she was the one inflicting it. He watched as she saved the most valuable animal on his ranch, a creature he loved like a son, with nothing but her own quiet strength. He had married a stranger, a burden he had resented. He was beginning to realize he had no idea who Theta Callaway was at all. She finished the last stitch, tied it off, and gently cleaned the area one last time. She patted the stallion's neck. "It is done," she whispered to the horse. Then she looked up at Nate. "He will need watching. The wound must be kept clean. He should not be moved for a few days." Theta tried to stand, but her legs, cramped from kneeling, gave way. She swayed, suddenly lightheaded, Before she could fall, a strong hand gripped her arm, steadying her. It was Nate. His touch was firm, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with her near fall. "I have you," he said, his voice quiet. He helped her to her feet. Her dress was ruined, smeared with dust and horse blood. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked exhausted, fragile, and yet he had never seen a stronger woman in his life. He let go of her arm as if it burned him. "Jed," Nate said, his voice like ice, "get this fence fixed. The rest of you, back to work." He turned his gaze back to Theta. The anger and disbelief were gone, replaced by a grudging, confused respect. "You will tend to the horse," he stated. It wasn't a request. It was an order. But the meaning had shifted. It was no longer a command to a servant, but a delegation of a vital duty to the only person competent enough to handle it. "Of course," Theta said. She looked past him to the black stallion, who was now calmly lipping at a bucket of water one of the hands had brought. He was alive. He would heal. She had done something that mattered. For the first time since arriving in this hard, lonely place, she felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It felt astonishingly like belonging. The days after the stallion's injury changed the rhythm of Theta's life. Her purpose was no longer simply to exist on the periphery. Her purpose was obsidian. Nate had named the horse for his color and his hardness, but Theta saw a different quality in him, a deep, steady loyalty once his trust was earned. Her care for him became the center of her world. Each morning before dawn, she would walk from her small cabin to the special stall near the main house where Obsidian was recovering. Nate had ordered him moved there, into a clean box stall filled with fresh straw. Theta would check the stitched wound, clean it with a saline solution she made herself, and apply a soothing poultice of comfrey and yarrow she found growing near the creek. The horse would nicker softly at her approach, dropping his head to her hand. Nate began to appear during these morning rituals. He would not enter the stall. He would lean against the opposite wall of the barn, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, and simply watch. He never spoke. Theta, at first unnerved by his silent presence, learned to ignore it. She focused on her work, on the horse, her movements gentle and efficient. But she was aware of him in every breath, every heartbeat. She could feel his gaze on her hands as she worked, on the line of her neck as she bent over the stallion. One morning, she arrived to find a new, clean bucket sitting just inside the stall door, filled with fresh water. The next day, a pile of soft, clean rags was folded neatly on a crate nearby. He never said a word, but the gestures were as clear as a spoken sentence. He was providing for her. He was seeing her work and acknowledging it. A strange, fragile connection was being built between them in the quiet, shared space of the barn, woven from silence and small, unspoken kindnesses. Jed the foreman did not share his employer's burgeoning respect. His resentment had festered, turning into a sour, simmering hostility. He had been shown up, his rugged competence made to look foolish by a mail-order bride who didn't even know how to properly sit a horse. He took every opportunity to belittle her. "Still playin' nursemaid to that animal?" he sneered one afternoon as Theta crossed the yard. "Boss ought to have just shot him. Would have been cheaper than all this fuss over your lady potions." Theta kept walking, her face a neutral mask. She had learned long ago that engaging with men like Jed was pointless. It only gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. "Too good to talk to the help now, are you?" he called after her, his voice louder, uglier. "Just 'cause you got the boss thinking you're some kind of miracle worker. You ain't nothin' but a piece of paper he bought from a catalog." A cold voice cut through the air, sharp as a shard of glass. "That's enough, Jed." Nate had stepped out of the blacksmith's forge, his face dark with a quiet fury. He moved to stand between Jed and Theta, a solid wall of protective anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer menace in his low tone was more effective than any shout. Jed paled. "Boss, I was just—" "I know what you were doing," Nate said, his eyes like chips of ice. "Mrs. Callaway is my wife. You will afford her the respect that title commands. If I hear you speak to her that way again, you'll be collecting your pay and riding out before sunset. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Jed mumbled, his gaze fixed on the dust. "Won't happen again." He turned and stalked away, his humiliation radiating from him like heat. Nate stood there for a moment, his back still to Theta. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, not as a legal fact, but as a statement of her position, her worth. Theta's heart was hammering against her ribs. He turned, and the fury in his face was gone, replaced by that familiar, shuttered look. But his eyes were troubled. "He won't bother you again," he said. It was almost an apology. He nodded stiffly and walked toward the main house, leaving her standing in the yard, the echo of his words ringing in the air. "Mrs. Callaway is my wife." The nights grew colder as autumn began to lay its hand on the high plains. A raw wind swept down from the mountains after dark, rattling the window of Theta's cabin. She worried about Obsidian. The stallion was healing well, but a chill could set him back. One night, unable to sleep, she pulled her thin shawl around her shoulders and made her way to the barn. A single lantern cast a pool of golden light in the aisle. Obsidian was on his feet, nickering softly as she entered. She ran a hand over his neck, checking his temperature, murmuring to him. The wind howled outside, finding its way through the cracks in the barn walls. Theta shivered, pulling the inadequate shawl tighter. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned, startled, to see Nate standing there, a heavy wool blanket draped over his arm. He must have seen the light in the barn from the main house. "You shouldn't be out," he said. His voice was rough, but it lacked its usual edge. "I was worried the cold would bother him," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, at the way she was hugging herself for warmth, her face pale in the lantern light. He saw not just the capable healer, but the woman, small and shivering in the vast cold night. He stepped forward. Without a word, he unfolded the blanket, the one from his own saddle, she realized, and draped it carefully over her shoulders. The wool was heavy and warm, and it smelled of leather and horse and of him. As he settled it around her, his fingers brushed against the side of her neck. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but it was electric. Theta froze, her breath catching in her throat. Nate went utterly still. They stood there in the quiet barn, separated by a hand's breadth, the world shrinking to the space between them. The air was thick with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't allowed themselves to feel. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the battle between the impenetrable wall he had built around his heart and the undeniable pull that was drawing them together. He was a powerful man, but in that moment, he looked lost, terrified by the crack she had made in his defenses. The need for her was beginning to grow in him, and it frightened him more than any physical danger. Then, as quickly as it came, the moment was gone. He dropped his hands and took a step back, breaking the spell. The shutters slammed down in his eyes. "See that you use it," he said, his voice gruff again. He turned on his heel and strode out of the barn, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Theta wrapped in the warmth of his blanket, her heart aching with a strange and painful hope. She fell asleep in the hay near Obsidian's stall that night, wrapped in the scent of him, and for the first time, she felt safe. Theta's quiet competence with the stallion began to earn her a grudging respect among some of the ranch hands. They saw the horse, once near death, now walking with only a slight limp. They saw the neat, clean line of the scar on his leg. They started to nod at her in the cookhouse, their curiosity turning to something like awe. But in the town of Redemption, a different story was taking root. The whispers started in the general store, nurtured by the town's self-appointed matriarch, Mrs. Gable. She was a woman whose influence was built on a foundation of piety and judgment. Her niece had been the obvious choice for Nate Callaway, a union that would have solidified the Gable family's standing. Theda's arrival had been an insult. Her subsequent success was a threat. "It isn't natural," Mrs. Gable would say over a bolt of calico, her voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. "The way that horse stood for her. They say Jed and 3 other men couldn't hold him, and now the creature follows her like a dog. It's not medicine. It's something else. Something unnatural." She didn't need to say the word. Others said it for her. Witchcraft. Hedge magic. Theda's skill, a thing of knowledge and empathy, was twisted into something dark and sinister. The story grew with each telling. It was said she chanted strange words over the horse, that the poultices she used were made from foul things gathered under a full moon. Theda felt the change in the atmosphere whenever she had to ride into town for supplies. The nods from strangers stopped. Shopkeepers became curt, their eyes skittering away from hers. Children would sometimes fall silent and point as she passed. She was an outsider again, but this time it was worse. She wasn't just unknown, she was feared. The source of her skill became the root of their suspicion. Theda had learned her healing from her father. He had been a doctor back east, a brilliant man who had grown frustrated with the limits of conventional medicine. He had studied herbalism, learned from immigrant communities, even spent time with a Native American tribe to understand their use of plants. His methods were effective but unorthodox, and they had earned him the scorn of his colleagues. A rival doctor, jealous of his success, accused him of quackery and malpractice. The medical board, steeped in tradition and prejudice, had stripped him of his license. The disgrace had broken him. He had died a pariah, and Theda had carried the weight of his shame all the way to Wyoming. Mrs. Gable, through a letter to a cousin back east, had unearthed the story of Dr. Alistair Finch, the disgraced physician. Now she had a name for Theda's unnatural abilities. Her father was a charlatan, thrown out of the profession for endangering his patients. She announced one Sunday after church, her voice ringing with self-righteous indignation. "She's using his dangerous tricks. It's a miracle that horse is even still alive. She's a menace to this community." The preacher, a stern man named Reverend Blackwood, took up the cause. From his pulpit, he spoke of the dangers of folk remedies and the devil's work masquerading as healing. He didn't name Theda, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The town, already primed for suspicion, turned against her completely. Nate was aware of the rumors. He heard them from the younger hands who still held a grudging admiration for Theda. He saw the cold looks she received in town. He was a man who cared little for the opinions of others, but he understood the danger. A frontier town's fear could curdle into violence with frightening speed. He found himself watching her more closely, a protective instinct he refused to name stirring within him. He saw the strain in her face, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, but she never complained. She bore the town's hostility with the same quiet dignity with which she had borne his own coldness. The threat became concrete one evening when Theda was returning from the creek bed, her basket filled with the herbs she used for Obsidian's daily care. 2 men, reeking of whiskey from the saloon, blocked her path. "There's the horse witch," one of them slurred, a smirk on his face. "Heard you can talk to animals," the other one said, stepping closer. "Maybe you can tell my mule why he's so damned stubborn." Theda clutched her basket, her heart pounding. "Please let me pass." "Not so fast," the first man said, reaching for her arm. "Maybe you can show us one of your spells." Before his fingers could touch her, a dark shape loomed up behind them. "I suggest you take your hands off my wife." Nate's voice was dangerously quiet. He hadn't been following her, but he had seen them from the porch of the main house and had walked over, his stride long and purposeful. The 2 men spun around, their drunken bravado evaporating when they saw the look on Nate's face. No harm meant, Mr. Callaway, one stammered. Just having a bit of fun. Your fun is over, Nate said. Get off my land. They scrambled away like chastened dogs. Nate turned to Theda. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She had not cried out, had not flinched. Are you all right? He asked, his gaze searching her face. I am fine, she said, though her voice shook slightly. She looked down at the herbs in her basket, the source of her power and her peril. It is just talk. Talk can be dangerous, he said, his jaw tight. He looked toward the distant lights of the town, then back at her. For a moment she thought he might say something more, something to bridge the gap between them. But he just gave a curt nod. Be careful. He turned and walked back to the house, a solitary, powerful man guarding a kingdom that was beginning to turn on his queen. Theda watched him go, the cold wind feeling suddenly colder, the threat no longer just whispers, but a physical presence that had dared to lay its hands on her. The turning point came 2 weeks later. Obsidian, whose recovery had been textbook perfect, suddenly took a turn for the worse. He refused his feed, and he stood in his stall with his head hanging, his coat dull. A fever had taken hold of him, and he was trembling, a fine sheen of sweat on his skin despite the cool air. Theda felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She checked the wound. It was clean, healing beautifully, with no sign of pus or swelling. This was not an infection from the gash. This was something else, something internal. Jed saw his opportunity. He stormed into the barn where Theda was sponging the stallion down with cool water. I knew it, he declared, his voice triumphant and ugly. I knew your witchery would poison him in the end. Look at him, he's dying. He didn't wait for a response. He went straight to Nate, who was in his office going over the ranch ledgers. Boss, you gotta come see. It's the stallion. Her potions have finally done for him. He's got the fever bad. It's her fault. I told you she was no good. Nate's face hardened. He followed Jed to the barn. He saw the state of the horse, the animal's labored breathing, the trembling in his powerful legs. He saw Theda, her face etched with worry, trying to comfort the suffering animal. All the old fears rose up in him, the fear of loss, of failure, of being responsible for the death of something he loved. He remembered his first wife, the fever that had taken her, the helplessness he had felt. The town's whispers, Jed's accusations, and his own deep-seated guilt all coalesced into a single terrible moment of decision. What is this? He demanded, his voice harsh. I don't know, Theda said, her own fear making her voice thin. The wound is clean. It's a fever, but not from the cut. It must be something he ingested. Or something you gave him, Jed cut in, his eyes glittering with malice. The whole town's talking about it, about your hedge magic. Now look, proof. Nate looked from Jed's accusing face to Theda's desperate one, and then to the horse. The stallion, his greatest pride, was fading before his eyes. The weight of the town's judgment, the foreman's certainty, and his own devastating history of loss became too much to bear. The wall he had built around his heart was not just to keep others out. It was to keep his own pain in. And now that pain was threatening to break free. He had to regain control. He made a choice. He chose what was known over what was not. He chose the opinion of his men over the word of this strange woman who had unsettled his entire world. He chose to retreat into the cold, hard shell of the man he had been before she arrived. Stay away from him, he ordered, his voice flat and dead. Theda stared at him, her heart stopping. What? You heard me. You are not to touch this horse again, he said, turning his back on her to face his foreman. Jed, get a man to watch him, give him water. That's all. He looked back at Theda, his eyes as cold and distant as they had been on the day she arrived. The fragile connection they had built lay shattered in the dust of the barn floor. I think it would be best if you packed your things, The eastbound stage leaves in 2 days. I'll have Jed drive you into town in the morning. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was casting her out. After everything, after she had saved this very horse, after those quiet moments in the barn, he was choosing to believe the whispers, to sacrifice her to his fear. She had been publicly humiliated, judged, and found wanting. The brief hope she had allowed herself to feel curdled into a bitter, aching despair. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. Her pride, the only thing she truly owned, would not allow it. She simply looked at him one last time, her eyes conveying all the pain and betrayal that her lips would not speak. Then she turned and walked out of the barn, away from the horse she had saved, away from the man she had just realized she was falling in love with. She walked back to her lonely cabin, each step taking her further into the desolate landscape of her own heart. The lowest point had come. It was over. Back in the cabin, Theda did not pack. She sank onto the edge of her bed, the cold finality of Nate's words echoing in the silence. To be dismissed, to be sent away like a failed servant, it was a humiliation that cut deeper than any insult Jed could have hurled. But beneath the despair, a different feeling began to stir. Anger. Not at Nate, whose fear she understood even if she could not forgive it, but at the injustice of it all. She knew what was wrong with Obsidian. It was not her poultices. It was lung fever, brought on by a specific weed that sometimes grew in the low-lying pastures after a rain. It was rare, but she had seen her father treat it once. The symptoms were identical. The cure was just as rare, a hardy, deep-rooted herb called mule's tail that grew only on the high, rocky slopes of the nearby hills. It had to be prepared fresh. Without it, the stallion's lungs would fill, and he would be dead by morning. She could leave. She could pack her bag, accept the ride to town, and disappear from this place that had offered a flicker of hope only to snatch it away. It was the sensible thing to do. It was what Nate wanted. But then she thought of Obsidian, his labored breathing, the trust he had placed in her. She thought of her father, who had taught her that a healer's duty was to the patient, not to the opinions of other men. To leave now would be to betray the horse, her father's memory, and the very core of who she was. She would not run. As darkness enveloped the ranch, Theda made her decision. She slipped out of the cabin, moving through the shadows like a ghost. The ranch was quiet, the bunkhouse dark. She crept to the small corral behind the barn where the less valuable horses were kept. She found a gentle mare she had sometimes fed apples to, slipped a bridle over her head, and swung herself onto the horse's bare back. With no saddle and only her knowledge of the land to guide her, she rode out, not east toward town and escape, but north, toward the dark and forbidding silhouette of the hills. Meanwhile, Nate sat alone in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He had done what was necessary. He had restored order. He had made the rational choice. So why did his victory feel so much like desolation? He stared at the marriage certificate he had signed, the legal document that bound him to the woman he had just banished. He remembered her face in the barn, the wounded disbelief in her eyes. He remembered the feel of her neck beneath his fingers when he had given her the blanket, the jolt of warmth that had pierced his frozen heart. He had closed himself off after his first wife's death, believing it was the only way to survive. He had built a fortress of power and solitude. Theda, with her quiet strength and unnerving decency, had breached his walls without even trying. She had made him feel again, and the feeling terrified him. Sending her away was an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to shore up his defenses. But the silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was empty. The loneliness he had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a tomb. A young ranch hand, a boy named Billy who idolized Nate, knocked hesitantly on the office door. "Sir? It's the Stallion. He's worse. Jed says..." He says it's time. Nate felt a cold dread. He followed Billy to the barn. Jed and 2 other men were standing by Obsidian's stall. Jed held a pistol in his hand. The horse was down, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Nate's heart clenched. This was it. The failure he had feared, come to pass. "Where is she?" Nate asked suddenly, looking around the barn. "The bride?" Jed grunted. "In her cabin, I suppose. Packin'." "Billy," Nate said, his voice sharp. "Go check." The boy ran off and returned moments later, his face pale. "She's gone, sir. The cabin is empty. Her bag is still there, but she's gone. And one of the mares is missing from the back corral." Jed scoffed. "See? Ran off. Couldn't face what she did." But Nate knew better. Theda was not a coward. She didn't run from a fight. She had endured his coldness, the town's scorn, the foreman's hatred, all without a word of complaint. If she was gone, it was not because she was running away. It was because she was running toward something. The herbs. The cure she had spoken of. She had defied his order to save his horse, to save him from his own foolish, fearful pride. In that instant, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The town's approval, his reputation, the wall of ice around his heart. None of it was worth the echoing emptiness of a world without her in it. "Don't you touch that horse!" Nate snarled at Jed, his voice filled with a sudden, fierce authority. He strode out of the barn, saddled his own horse with frantic speed, and galloped out into the night, following the faint tracks that led toward the hills. He was not riding to capture an errant woman. He was riding to bring back the missing part of his own soul. He found her an hour later, riding down from the high slopes, the mare she was on tired and sweaty. Theda's dress was torn by branches, her hair wild, but in the moonlight she looked magnificent. She held a pouch in one hand, filled with the precious herbs. She saw him approaching and pulled her horse to a stop, her face wary, expecting another confrontation. Nate swung down from his saddle before his horse had even fully stopped. He walked toward her, his heart in his throat. "Theda," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer hide. "I was wrong." The simple words hung in the cold night air. An admission, an apology, a surrender. "He's still alive," Theda said, her voice tight. "But we have to hurry." They rode back together, side by side, a silent truce declared between them. When they reached the barn, Jed was standing by the stall door, the pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of stubborn pride. "Boss, he's sufferin'. It's the only way." Nate dismounted and walked straight up to his foreman. He stood in front of the stall, blocking the way. "No," he said, his voice ringing with absolute command. He looked at Jed, then at the other men who had gathered, their faces lit by the flickering lanterns. "She is my wife, and she is the only one who has known what to do from the start. Now get out of her way. Let her work." It was a public declaration, a choice. In front of everyone, he had put down his pride, defied his foreman, and placed his faith entirely in her. Jed stared, his mouth agape, then slowly lowered the pistol, his face contorted with defeat. Theda slid from her horse, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and pushed past him into the stall. She knelt by Obsidian's head, crushing the mule's tail herbs with a stone, mixing them with hot water to create a potent, steaming mash. She gently forced the poultice into the horse's mouth, encouraging him to swallow, her voice a low, constant murmur of encouragement. Nate stood guard at the door. He did not leave. He watched her work, his heart aching with regret and a fierce, burgeoning love. She had saved his horse when he had given up. She had saved him from his own worst instincts. The rescue was mutual. She was pulling him from the grief that had frozen him for years, and he, by standing with her, was pulling her from the exile the world had forced upon her. They waited. Theda sat in the straw, her hand on Obsidian's neck, while Nate stood vigil at the door. The hours ticked by. Just before dawn, the stallion's ragged breathing began to even out. The trembling subsided. He gave a great shuddering sigh and, for the first time in a day, closed his eyes in what looked like a peaceful sleep. The fever had broken. Theda looked up at Nate, her face exhausted but luminous in the pale morning light. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Nate crossed the stall in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. He reached out and gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "I told you once that talk can be dangerous," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the right words can save a man's life." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, there were no walls, no shutters. There was only him. "You saved him, Theda. You saved us both." A month later, the autumn sun warmed the porch of the main house. Theda sat in a sturdy rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap, though she wasn't sewing. She was watching Obsidian trot around the main corral, his gait strong, the only sign of his ordeal a faint silver scar on his leg. The small, isolated cabin by the cottonwoods stood empty. She had moved into the main house the day after the fever broke. Jed was gone. Nate had paid him his wages and sent him on his way without another word. The whispers in town had not vanished entirely, but they had been replaced by a current of grudging respect, fanned by the story Billy and the other hands told of how the boss's wife had ridden into the mountains alone to save the Callaway stallion. Mrs. Gable was said to be furious, but fewer people were listening to her now. The evenings had become Theda's favorite time of day. Nate would finish his work, and they would sit on the porch together as the sun went down, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence that was more intimate than any conversation. The grief had not vanished from his face, but it no longer defined him. It had been softened by something new, something that looked like peace. He came out of the house and handed her a cup of tea, then sat in the rocker beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the land, his land, with her. The silence was full of the life they were beginning to build, a life of shared glances, small kindnesses, and the quiet certainty of belonging. "You know," he said finally, his voice a low, warm rumble, "my father built this house. He always said a ranch this size needed a strong heart at its center." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a deep, steady warmth she had once thought impossible. "I had this house built for a family, Theda. For a long time, I had forgotten that." He reached over and took her hand. His was calloused and strong, hers smaller but no less capable. Their fingers intertwined. It was not a grand, passionate declaration. It was something better. It was a quiet, irreversible choice, a promise. The frontier was still wild, the winters still harsh, but here, on this porch, with his hand holding hers, Theda was no longer an outsider. She was home. The king of this vast, dusty kingdom had been broken, and the quiet woman the world had discarded had shown him how to heal. She had saved him just as surely as he had saved her, and in the space between them, love had finally found room to grow.